In this lesson, we will learn specifically what are the requirements for 11G R2 rack system. What we can see here is I am using Oracle's VirtualBox, so I am virtualizing my rack environment. In this particular case, my host computer will be Oracle's Linux. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and we can see that I have my two Linux machines up and running. So this one I'm going to go ahead and unlock and log in, and the password here is going to be Oracle. I'm going to go over here to node 2. That password is Oracle as well. Each individual node, for starters, will need two NIC cards. The reason that we're going to need two network interface cards is because in an Oracle rack environment, we have a public IP and we also have a private IP. Over here on node 2, I'm going to go ahead and type in cat etc host, and this is going to identify the IP addresses and the NIC cards that I will need. So here, for my public IP, I'm using IP 192.168.2.101 for rack 1, and I'm using 2.102 to rack 2, and that is my public IP address. My private IP address is going to be 192.168.0.101 for rack 1-priv, and for 0.102, rack 2-priv. So what will happen is that you will bind the public IP address to NIC 1 and the private IP address to NIC 2. When you bind that IP address to NIC 2, you will not give it a subnet. Let's come over here and demo that. If I go to System, Administration, and I log into Network, provide it the password, here I can see ETH1 is my second NIC card, and here I'm just binding the IP address, but I do not give it a subnet mask or a default gateway. So let me go ahead and cancel out of this, and minimize this, and minimize this. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to open up my VirtualBox. We're going to go through the hardware settings. Here I'm just going to come over to node 1. So first of all, for hardware settings, if I come over here under my virtual machine, at network, we see that we have two NIC cards. For memory, over here I can see that the base memory is at least 6 gig. This is actually a little bit light. In a typical rack environment, we would like to have each individual node to have a minimum of 8 gig. But for my demonstration purposes here, we're going to use only 6 gig. We should be on a Linux-based system. I would say some sort of Linux, either Red Hat or Oracle 5.0 or above. And you can see here that I've got ASM shareable drives. So on node 1, I have ASM 1 through ASM 5. If I come over here to node 2, I have ASM 1 through ASM 5. So in a typical rack environment, for a hardware perspective, we're looking for an operating system on some sort of Linux operating system, either Red Hat 5 or above, or Oracle 5 or above. Each individual node should have a minimum of 8 gigs of RAM. For my demonstration purposes here, they only have 6. They are required to have a minimum of 2 NIC cards, and then we should have shareable devices. The shareable devices in an Oracle 11G R2 rack environment will be your ASM devices, and they will be for your data disk group, your FRA disk group, as well as your rack node disk group. When we talk about the rack disk group, that is going to be the default location for your OCR and your voting disks. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and I'm going to go ahead and open up my node 2. I'm going to come over here back to node 1. In my particular case, I'm going to do a PWD, and you can see that I have user2 stage grid. I'm going to go ahead and CD and back up a directory, and I'm doing ls. As far as software requirements is concerned, for 11G R2 rack environment, we will need to download and install the Oracle Grid Infrastructure Architecture. The Grid Infrastructure Architecture does two things for us. It brings in the cluster software, and it also brings in an ASM instance, as well as enables us to configure the ASM instance. You can see here that I've already downloaded this from Oracle. So I have the Linux 64-bit 11G R2 grid, as well as the 64-bit database, and those are going to be 2 separate downloads. We have a total of 3 downloads here, 2 downloads for the database and 1 download for the grid. It is very, very important that you have the grid infrastructure architecture. As a matter of fact, you cannot use Oracle 11G R2 rack without the grid infrastructure architecture. It provides the cluster software, the ASM instance, as well as Oracle Restart. Then you must also download and install the Oracle 11G database software. Keep in mind, it used to be prior to 11G R2, you had the ASM software separate, you had the cluster software, and then the database software. So you actually had 3 installs. With Oracle 11GR2, you only have 2 installs. You have the grid infrastructure install, and then you have the database install. As part of the grid infrastructure install, what it does is it installs all the cluster software, it installs the ASM software, it configures the ASM instance, it configures a default ASM disk group, and also brings in Oracle Restart. After you do that, you will need to go through and install the database software. Now, this is just like any other software. Go ahead and install the database software, but then come back in and configure the database using DBCA. For a rack install, you're going to do 3 things. Install the grid infrastructure software, install the database software, and then create the database. It is best practice when you install the grid infrastructure software to also configure the ASM instance. You could install the grid infrastructure software and then come back at a later time and install the ASM instance. However, it's best practices to do them all. What we're looking at here as far as what are going to be the minimum requirements for 11G R2 rack environment. You'll need to have multiple nodes. Each individual node should have at least 8 gigs of memory. They should be Linux nodes. They should be a Red Hat Linux 5 or above, Oracle Linux 5 or above. Each individual node needs to have 2 separate NIC cards, one for the public IP, one for the private IP. The corresponding host file should be configured accordingly if you're not using DNS. Each individual node should be able to see the shared disk drives. In our particular case, we have 5 shareable disk drives that both nodes can see. After you've configured those devices, from an Oracle software perspective, you're going to need to download and install the Oracle Grid Infrastructure software as well as the Oracle Database software. Now, I'm actually going to validate that each individual node can see these disk drives. So on node 1, I'm going to log on as root, and I'm going to go to etc init.d. And under an etc init.d, I can issue this command Oracle ASM list disks. When I do that, on node 1, I can see that node 1 sees disks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I come over here to node 2, and I switch user to root, and I change directory to etc init.d, and issue that same command, Oracle ASM list disks, I see those same disks. So we can see that we do have shareable disks. At this stage, once we have downloaded the software, configured our machines, make sure before you install any software that each individual node can see the other node. I'm going to validate this from node 1. I'm going to ping node 2. So node 1 can see node 2. I'm going to come over here to node 2, and I'm going to ping node 1. Sure enough, I can do that. Best practices would also be to ping the private interconnect. So I type in ping rack1-priv. I can do it. And if I go to node 1 and I type in ping rack2-priv, they can see it. So at this stage of the game, the nodes are configured and are ready to have rack installed.